One of life's most difficult problems is sharing an idea. This idea was best summarized to me by a mentor of mine while she was teaching me how to write grants. She quoted Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw and stated that the most challenging problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. Later that same week, I learned that same lesson on a much more personal level when I first tried to describe a favorite YouTube video of mine to a friend before saying, "This is silly, I should just show it to you instead." And so I sat there nervously waiting and watching for her reaction for the video's over 3-minute runtime. And while she maintained a polite smile and even the occasional chuckle, I had made a grave mistake in my early communication. See, in my first excitement, I was acting as a nerd. I over-explained the video's content and didn't give it the space it needed to fully land with the audience. Starting with the facts got in the way of sharing laughter. And I took this and I used it as a great learning experience. Because you see, in my time in science communication, I haven't had that initial issue of first connecting with audiences. My story starts here at Duke as I worked as an emergency medical technician with our university's agency. And while doing so, I was introduced to the field of aerospace medicine, which is that perfect interest of critical care and high-altitude medicine. But I kept asking more questions. Where can we go further? And so soon I was asking, as we leave the atmosphere and Earth's gravity, where does that go? Well, it took me to NASA, where I work with a team of physicians and astronauts to build a course on space medicine, more formally called bioastronautics. When I came back here to Duke, and after a semester of teaching that course, we then launched a full online course and a complimentary podcast on space medicine. And those two words of space and medicine, I think, did so much of the heavy lifting for me. So, returning to that earlier awkward exchange, while it didn't leave a devastating impact on our friendship, it provided a much-needed insight on science communication, how to do it right, and how to avoid what I now appreciate of being a nerd. And so, what really comes down to science training and education is that we start with someone and we tell them to follow their passion, follow their interest into an academic discipline. And then, after over 8 years of training, they are an expert in some field. Perhaps that field will be underwater explosions that somehow mysteriously killed an entire submarine of Civil War soldiers, or something called classical scattering and 1+1 dimensional string theory, or even transformative learning theory in gerontology for non-traditional students. Now, those titles are complete mouthfuls, big words that are can push people away at first if that's how you start, because this is actually how we train a lot of scientific communicators. See, we tell people that as they pursue their education, they need to speak to smaller and smaller audiences of experts, and then learn techniques to signal that expertise to that very narrow group of people. And so what's left is people who are trained to use very complex and self-referential words instead of learning how to better appreciate and speak to larger and wider audiences. And so they're really good at communicating the facts, but they're not trained in how to make those facts connect with someone's heart and soul. And so this problem was summarized well by an economist named Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who stated that charm is the ability to insult people without offending them, and nerdiness is the reverse. And what this says right here is that we train academics in this very special skill set of how to not only speak to a very small audience, but maybe even push away people who aren't in that audience. And so that's the issue at the personal level. And then at the larger level, there's actually issues with science and STEM training. See, a 2017 New York Times analysis found that despite the classic wisdom that STEM is a safe degree field to go into, that there is vast underemployment in biology, in physics, math, and even engineering. And so at the end of 8 years of rigorous training, what do we do when people are finding themselves or underemployed? And then, as we look even larger, the sciences are so dependent on appealing to outside funding, be it from business or from government funding, and that this dependency is predicated on the scientist's ability to sell themselves. With changing political pressures or people looking to lower the budget, many scientists will recognize the oh-so-common criticism of, well, science is expensive, why should we continue to fund your research? And so all these factors together can make it actually hard to sell science to someone looking to go into it at the end of the day. And so what is one to do to fix this problem? Well, that brings me back to those 3 complicated titles that I introduced earlier. See, these 3 titles come from 3 mentors of mine who, in their own right, are all exceptional scientific communicators. These people here, however, did not start with their science. They didn't start with the scientific facts of the matter. And instead, they connected with me as a learner before then showing me where to go next, where the science leads. And so this left me wondering, is there some pattern, is there some lesson we can learn, some formula for success for introducing scientific topics and scientific ideas to folks? And thankfully, my time in space medicine has brought to me one shining example, something very powerful in science that has maintained a good reputation for the field. And that is the International Space Station. See, every year the United States spends $1.3 billion maintaining the system. And on top of that, it could even be considered wildly impractical. The lack of gravity and the higher dosages of radiation mean that the bones and muscles, eyes and hearts, and every cell of the astronauts on board are in peril. So they have to come back down to Earth after spending no more than a year up there. So it seems that it could be grossly expensive and wildly impractical. And yet kids continue to dream of being astronauts when they grow up. That NASA shares thousands of photos each year, and people are so excited to see them released. And on top of that, academics fight to get their research put on board this platform. So what 3 lessons, what 3 principles did I find from looking at the International Space Station and in selling science? Well, in order, they're mystery, synergy, and returns. So beginning with the principle of mystery, I started off by saying nerds are really good at over-explaining things, really good at letting the facts get in the way. But the issue is that when you start with the facts, you often will paint yourself into a corner, and rarely will an audience share your same interest or have the same knowledge as your doctoral advisor. Instead, it's better to start broader with something that hopefully everyone can relate to. Does anyone here have one of these in their pockets? If you do, you can thank aerospace science research for the batteries, the cameras, and the circuits on board. Or if any application on your phone uses the internet, you can then again thank rocket science for the satellites responsible for that communication. See, the important thing is that we can connect with any audience and hopefully start with something that speaks directly to them. But maybe people here don't think having all of human knowledge in their pockets is pretty cool. Fine. However, there are other benefits from putting human beings in space. Towards the end of the Cold War and following the fall of the USSR, the United States and either the USSR or then Russia collaborated on keeping and putting human beings in space. And so astronauts have been an effective tool for ambassadors, that they have been a platform to bring countries together and unite them despite what might be happening here on Earth. In fact, we even have a term in sociology to describe the change in perspective that happens when people look back at the Earth from space and realize that all the small personal problems don't really amount to that much, or even fighting between countries. Hard to see countries and borders from space, and that's called the overview effect. Now, did we anticipate cell phones or changes in international diplomacy when we first set our eyes on the moon? I don't think so. But this is the principle of mystery, that rather than starting with one specific example and getting too far too fast, start with trust that your science and your research will connect with your audience somewhere, and start by asking them questions and inviting them into the discussion. Because this then allows you to launch into the next step of synergy. And synergy is fun because this is where we get to brag about how we're going to solve the world's problems and look to the future. But rather than start with the cutting edge, the bleeding edge of your research, like a nerd would, and try to show how much they really know, it's often better to start with a few ideas that are more approachable to people, that people have some familiarity with, and then combine them together. And so this brings me to the very exciting idea of 3D printing hearts. See, on Earth, we're currently developing biomedical technologies for tissue engineering to allow us to grow organs for transplants. However, these are mostly limited to flat organs such as an ear or maybe something compact, not something hollow like a heart or full of many blood vessels like a kidney, but those are the most necessary organs. Those are the organs that people most need here on Earth. But remember earlier when I mentioned the lack of gravity in space or the lack of weight that you experience? Well, that may pose a hazard to the human beings on board, damaging our muscles and our bones, our eyes and our hearts. But it's actually the perfect environment for growing and developing hollow organs, such as the heart. And so this is the fantastically exciting part of synergy, that different scientific endeavors will come together in ways that you cannot anticipate and cannot expect. But someone has heard of 3D printing and someone has heard of organ transplants. Well, believe it or not, the International Space Station is a place where those two ideas come together. And this is not just limited to tissue engineering. Biomedical and pharmaceutical companies are looking to manufacture drugs in space. Again, the weightlessness actually allows for more pure biochemical reactions. And that would mean that the drugs that are made for people here on Earth are cleaner, healthier, and are more likely to produce the outcomes desired. Or, alternatively, that radiation that I mentioned that you experience more in space, well, that can also be a platform. I recently had the pleasure of interviewing a high school student who is going to investigate anti-aging technology by putting worms on board the International Space Station and then sequencing their DNA. She's pretty cool, and I think really does show this principle of synergy, wherein academics shouldn't be siloed off to one domain, but instead working with others and collaborating. And this is really a good way of exciting people and speaking to where the future directions might lead us. The entire field of medicine is predicated on chemistry and biology working to improve access and drugs. But on top of that, you could even turn to the field of economics, which pulls from physics and math to use increasingly complex formulas to have real-world outcomes here on Earth. And then, hopefully after engaging the audience and then getting them excited to look to the future, we're now ready to return to that objection that I mentioned earlier about the high cost of science. See, we didn't start with answering it, but it's an important thing to be prepared to answer, which allows us to talk about the idea of returns. In a few short years, the International Space Station will be decommissioned, and in its place will go up commercial space stations. Many companies are excited to look into this because they want to be the platforms on which we print those organs, we develop those drugs, and we conduct that scientific research. And so rather than look at the cost of science as an expenditure that we need to mitigate, it should be looked at as a long-term investment. And this really is what returns gets at, that science will inevitably pay for itself. See, the United States economy now runs on aerospace travel, on internet communications, on computational sciences, and on the pharmaceuticals produced here. And that was all made possible through early investment in science. And because we cannot predict what the science will produce, we also can be assured that there will be many ways in which the science will benefit us, even if some projects are losers. The nice thing about it is that the huge successes of some of those products I mentioned, for antibiotics, for example, that success alone can pay for so much medical investigations that maybe don't amount to anything particularly exciting immediately. But trust that science will inevitably pay for itself. And then this is the most important point that we always like to be prepared with, that the data-driven nerds want to provide. But the issue is that starting there and starting with that fact often meets people not ready to listen, which is why it's important to have all three steps together. So let's put it together. Starting with mystery. Does anyone here have a friend, family, or loved one who needs or has needed an organ transplant? I do. And for people who aren't raising your hands, it's likely that you actually do know someone, as there's over 100,000 people in the United States alone waiting for organ transplants. And there probably would be many more if we didn't have such selective wait lists. Well, this brings me to synergy. And I mentioned before that we're going to bring tissue engineering with the platform of space such that we can print these organs for larger and larger groups. We can address this pressing need, which then brings us to returns. Not only would this provide relief to the over 17 people that die each day waiting for an organ transplant, but it would also provide economic benefits for people here in the United States and across the world as they look to find employment with these companies and develop these products. So at the end of its over 30 years, we can thank the International Space Station for its countless lessons that it's provided us, including these ones. While someone might not immediately connect with your research and area of study, trust that this formula will work and will help someone connect and appreciate your work. Because after all, an idea is only as valuable as our ability to share it with others.